So we now move on, and it's a case of before the Lord Mayor's show, in this case, with Rob Payton, who's Head of Conservation and Collections Care at the Museum of London. Over to you, Rob.
Sorry, how did you...
Clock's ticking.
Okay, thank you. The Lord Mayor's State Coach has had a long history going back to its construction in 1757. It has been described as one of the world's oldest ceremonial vehicles still in use. It provides an extreme example of the ethical challenges faced by conservators and specialists looking after working objects. The coach is actually owned by the City of London Corporation, who lend it for 50 weeks of the year to the Museum of London. But for the 2 weeks in early November, the corporation remove it so that it can be prepared for the annual Lord Mayor's procession. During the practice runs, press shots and the actual procession, this 255-year-old coach is exposed to the full vagaries of the London climate and rigours of movement by 6 heavy shire horses over rough roads. As a result, the coach has had to be heavily maintained throughout its long history, with structural, wooden, metal, fabric and leather parts having to be repaired and quite often replaced. My view is that such changes are an inevitable part of the history of the coach in use, and it is still a live object. Previous mayors have also had the coach embellished and decorated to their tastes. For example, the crimson and gilded coach that we see today had in fact been painted blue and gold for several years in the 18th century, as evidenced by the cross-sections of the top of the coach cabin. And I'd made a colour swatch of these layers, which indicated there's over 80 layers of ground paint and varnish layers. Extensive restorations have taken place before state coronations, the last in 1952, when a coach restorer was happy to publish that he had stripped down to wood and iron the surface parts of the coach, leaving only the original painted sign panels by Cipriani intact. All the fabric had also been replaced. Some changes were necessary to make the coach safer on the roads. In 1939, when interior lights were added, and in 1951, when brakes were installed. However, the coach still continues to have metal-rimmed wheels. The current coach continues to be, therefore, a mix of historical interferences, but to the average spectator watching the Lord Mayor's procession in their tens of thousands, it is the old Lord Mayor's coach. If we as conservators try to question this artifice, are we not being too precious? Similarly, if we question whether the coach should still be used as parts may then need to be replaced, are we not denying future generations the joy of appreciating such an object? With a coach that has been heavily restored, at what stage has the coach lost its authenticity and the enough is enough stage reached? When 30%, 50% or more has been replaced? Perhaps when an object like this is continually evolving, it is the iconic nature of the piece rather than the actual physicality of the materials comprising the piece that is more important. However, as the coach is continually being restored, to what period of history should the restoration be taken? Should we accept every previous restoration as being authentic, to be preserved, or remove these to create a perceived period of historical authenticity? What can we be doing as responsible and ethical conservators is influencing these complex decisions by coming up with scientific ways of preserving the coach that will still leave options open for the future. An example of a good ethical solution was the replacement of the 4 leather straps that suspend the cabin of the coach over the superstructure. Through stress-strain testing and chemical analysis, it showed that these were beyond the safety limits to support the weight of the cabin in use. Replacement of the original straps with like for like would have taken a lot of money, been extremely costly, lengthy, and very difficult to achieve. The corporation who owned the coach employed a structural engineer to work with traditional craftsmen to fit modern structural synthetic webbing straps within the original leather straps so that they could take all the weight without the leather having to do so. A second example was the repairs to cracks in the wooden structures. After some recent excursions in the pouring rain, it was found that some of the decorative elements were barely held on, the presumably water-soluble glue having been totally rinsed out. I was able to influence and train the coach restorers to use a more ethical approach to adhering loose pieces and filling those cracks where rainwater could have ingress. Instead of using white glues or silicon sealants as proposed, Paralog B72 was used, and other resins could be used in different ways to effect a better and a more reversible result. Elsewhere, I advised on the use of X-rays to identify why deep cracks in the wooden superstructure had not caused the coach to collapse. The X-ray survey showed that these pieces were in fact a substantial iron framework clad in wood. So rather than plugging the joints with silicon sealant, as was proposed, all that was needed was for the cracks to be made weatherproof and with a more reversible filler. The second ethical conundrum when dealing with a coach is that of dual standards of care. Reading the old MGC guidelines on the standards of care of larger and working objects, I had to think, are we in fact discussing standards for caring for the coach or ethics? I would argue that you can have standards for care or use of an object, but ethics should provide the moral framework that drives the decision-making process for that care. In the Code of Ethics, ECHO 2002-1, the care and prevention of damage of an object is described in the context of being as far as is compatible with its social use, a very helpful phrase in relation to this particular object. However, in this instance, it is the ethical dilemma of maintaining the coach as a static display for 50 weeks of the year, trying to meet fairly rigid loan agreement criteria, and then reconciling this with the use of the coach that inevitably results every year in some form of damage.
Okay, Rob, we're going to need you to conclude, please.
Okay. I was going to show the difference between the loan conditions in red and those that actually exist in, and you could see the difference between the green and red figures, and the ones in brackets are actually showing the actual date there.
Okay.
And I was just going to finish off by saying that within 20 minutes, the ethical approach to the coach changed within 20 minutes from that to that.
Okay.
And perhaps the way forward is to box it up.
Okay.
I'll leave it.
Point well made.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Rob. Now I'm going to go to Kieran. Could you please respond to that, please?
The coach is used 1 day a year for practical use, and I think the physicality of it has to be linked with the intangible nature of it, and it's been used, as you said, for 250 years, 55 years. How much of it's actually original? I mean, if we look at the repairs over that period and think of the kind of conditions that would have been used in the roads of London 200 years ago, a lot more damage probably would have been caused to it, and much of it is probably not what we would call original material. So I think in context of originality, how much of it's actually original? I mean, but its intangible heritage is as important as the actual the tangible aspect of the coach. And for 1 day a year to be used as part of a cultural tradition of the capital city of one of the greatest countries in the world, then it's important that it should be kept used, in my opinion, because it's an icon, and as an icon, I think it's for 1 day, as you said, it's a small price to pay, and how much damage is actually being caused.
The coach actually goes out for 2 weeks, although you actually only see it on the procession for 1 day. But, for example, this last November, it went out into the pouring rain during a practice procession because we didn't want it to conflict with a student march the very next day. Regarding replacements, a very valid point, and I would suggest that probably looking at the records of what work's been done on the coach, you're looking at probably, I would guess, about at least 90% of that coach has been replaced. So I made the point that it's actually an evolving object, and I don't have a problem with that. It's part of its history. Just as the coach wasn't originally there, the Lord Mayor originally went by horse until he was thrown over by a fisherwoman, and then they decided to get a coach. So yeah, it's an evolving piece. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go to the back of the auditorium. We have a question, then I'll come down the front here. There's one, and then you, Chris. Okay, two.
Hi, I'm Sarah Paul Camel. I'd just like to say, I think yes, significance does change over time, and I think it's very important that we realise that authenticity isn't the only value that we can assign to objects, and it's not always the most important value. It's about the context of the object that it should inform your choices, and I think as long as we communicate them to justify our decisions and that we record them then for future generations to see where we've come from, I think that is really key. As a point, and I think then that would work for, because obviously there's social value, there's historical value to the coach, and I think as long as you're kind of staying true to them as well, then that's ethical as well.
I think it's a very good point that the reason that we know it's been so heavily replaced is because we've got excellent records going back to all the gilders, all the woodworkers, the craftsmen who've worked on it over the years. So we do know it's had. Even that is really fascinating, the history of the changes and the decisions. A lot of it's down to political reasons. They didn't have enough money to restore the coach, so it was left to go into a pretty bad state, and therefore needed quite major restorations later on. Perhaps a lesson for people who are working with working objects not to leave it to go too far, because you then have to do something fairly substantial.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Deborah Kane, Birmingham Museums. With your last slide, Rob, it would possibly appear to me that it's the loan agreement with the owners that is actually causing a lot of your ethical dilemmas, and that possibly a re-education, negotiation to realistic expectations might help you guys deal with this.
It's a very good point. You may not believe that, but that was after negotiations. Some negotiations.
You need to go back and play hardball.
They originally wanted 50 lux for and this was in a south-facing window for something that will have used up its cumulative lux for one day of sunshine when it's out. So it doesn't make sense now.
I think in business terms you need an intelligent client function. But anyway, question or response from the front.
Chris Knapp again. I think the question we've got to ask before you can make any decisions on this object, is it a working vehicle still being used for its original purpose by its owners that you are fortunate enough to loan for 50 weeks of the year, or is it a museum object that you loan out for a procession? Because if it's the former, I personally have no issue whatsoever with it being used. It's the owner is using it what it's designed for. If it's the latter, I would say you're really risking your object.
Yeah. It's a very, very good point, that actually, and I think as the coach is not owned by the Museum of London, it's the onus on the owners to actually have the priority on the use of the coach for those 2 weeks. So those 2 weeks do take precedence. I would argue that probably for the 50 weeks that we hold on to it, I think the idea is that we try and stabilise it for as much as possible so that it can be used for those two weeks. I think that's the way it's been sorted around, but it's a very good point, that. Yeah.
Okay, we have Rachel. Let's make a response.
Practical question about funding. Do the owners contribute anything to the time it's in the museum and the extra conservation work beyond, say, things like replacing the webbing?
Yes, the corporation do fund the conservation. They had a £500,000 conservation plan for fully restoring the coach up to fully working order. But due to funding cuts, that's been totally cut now. So it's just being done on a very much piecemeal level. And I see my role as trying to stop them as ethically cutting corners. I mean, we mentioned the ethics of cutting corners when we're not really doing our job properly. And as I said, there was a few cases where they simply just wanted to squirt bathroom sealant into parts of the coach, and it was able to affect a more sympathetic approach to the coach.
It's interesting. I mean, we haven't heard the P word today, which is the pragmatism word, which we used to see quite a lot in these debates. And there is a real issue, isn't there, around where does pragmatism become? Where do you start to infringe or impinge on those ethical codes by being pragmatic and responding to the situations that you have to deal with? But we're going to have to wind that one up there, I'm afraid. Thank you very much, Rob, and we're going to move on to the next speaker.